The countdown to the next college football season is on. And as with every college athletics season, questions about money's role in college athletics are swirling. How much money do colleges bring in through athletics? What are the regulations surrounding recruiting? And should college athletes be paid? Gordon Voit of One TV in Illinois joins us to discuss those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm your host, Sam Chen. The college athletics season is right around the corner, and that brings back into the limelight conversations about money's role in NCAA athletics. Questions including, what's the role of money in recruiting? Should we pay our college athletes? And so forth. Joining me tonight, friend of the show, Gordon Voit, the sports director and lead anchor of One TV in Illinois, and a Heisman Trophy voter. Gordon, welcome back to the program.
Sam, great to be here. I got invited back. That means it didn't blow it last time. I'm pumped.
I know. I'm shocked. Our viewers actually liked you. I kid. It's always good to have you back, Gordon. It's good to see you. Hope things in Illinois are going well. Let's just jump right into this. Let's start with the 30,000 foot level. I think there's a lot of confusion. There are a lot of different conceptions about the role that money plays in college athletics as a whole, even before we get into the nitty-gritty with
Absolutely.
Student athletes and recruiting and things like that. How big of a role do finances play in college athletics?
Enormous. I mean, you're talking about schools that are making up to $215 million a year. That's what University of Texas, the #1 revenue driver in the country, is making. Now, do most schools make that much money? Absolutely not. And that's something that we can talk about, the difference in the tiers that the revenue kind of stacks up. But it's enormous. I mean, it's basically had a lot of good intentions and then a lot of positive effects, and then some that people are wondering if they need to be changed. So it'd be interesting to unpack that with you.
Sure.
In this episode, and then hopefully one more even after that, because this is just such a, I mean, if this was a book, it would be about that thick on it because it's just so complicated. But to answer your question, it's huge. I mean, we're talking about an NCAA that brings in $1 billion a year from basically two sources, schools that are bringing in upwards of $200 billion. So we are talking about a large stack of cash, Sam.
Yeah, you mentioned the University of Texas doing the $215 million a year. I mean, and that's just one school that's doing that. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you mentioned was that a lot of this also depends on the size of the school. Obviously, University of Texas is a Division I, big Power 5 conference. They're in the Big 12. How does that change across the board? If you're looking at Division I FBS versus Division I FCS in our region, Lehigh Lafayette is the big rivalry here, but they're in the FCS or the old mm-hmm. Division I AA. And then we got Division II schools, Division III schools. You cover a lot of these schools. How does that revenue trickle down?
That's an amazing question. It's incredibly important to recognize those tiers between a Lehigh or Lafayette versus a Texas or Baylor, your alma mater, our alma mater. So first of all, you need to understand where this money's coming from. Mm-hmm. The reason that it's spiking, it's not because of ticket sales. In fact, those are actually a little bit down from what they were in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's not from merchandising, although that's obviously on a steady increase. The reason that this is an explosive growth market, that college athletics is explosively bigger than it used to be, is TV. Okay. That's the reason, because that is by far the most valuable property that these universities own, is the TV rights. And those contracts keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we could probably do a whole episode about why that is. In short, it has to do with it's the only thing that you can't DVR. That's still the most valuable advertising property, right, is live sports content, because nobody wants to go home and watch the Lehigh game on replay or the Penn State game on replay if they already knew the score. Some right. people do. Most people don't. So that means is that this asset that these schools have, the live TV rights, mm-hmm. are worth a huge amount of money. Let me give you a quick example before we delve into the difference that you asked about, the difference in the tiers. just to put a number on it. So the Big Ten just recently surpassed the SEC, who had been leading the nation in average revenue given per school for the last 3 years. The Big Ten just came out with a $51 million payout, which surpassed the SEC.
Wow.
So every single Big Ten school that is fully vested, so Rutgers and Maryland are still in that transition phase, they don't get a full share. But a school like Illinois that I cover, or Michigan State, or Nebraska, or Northwestern gets $51+ million a year strictly from the Big Ten network.
Wow.
So we're talking about a huge amount of money. And there's a lot of different complicated sort of sub factors within that. I think it's a great thing because it's meant that schools can be more independent. They don't have to go to taxpayers or student fees like they used to have to rely on to support athletics. Now it's self-funded because they're generating the money themselves. That's a different topic. Let's go back to your original question about the differences. There's a huge difference between if you're in a sexy TV conference and not.
Sure.
So if you're in a Power 5 conference, every school except for Washington State makes over $75 million a year.
Just on TV?
In revenue. No, sorry. Overall.
Overall, okay.
Overall athletic department revenue. So if you're a Power 5 school, you almost always make more than $75 million. Then there's a big gap between those conferences and then some of the middle tier conferences, such as Conference USA, Mountain West Conference, or the Patriot League, of course, would then be down below there. So there's a huge, huge, huge difference between if you're University of Texas and you have the Longhorn Network, just basically raking in piles of cash from that and through the Big 12's rights. Then there's a big drop off to, say, the Mountain West Conference. If you're Colorado State, you're New Mexico, you're probably making in more the $30 to $45 million range a year in revenue. And then there's a huge drop off all the way down to $3, $4, $5 million. Chicago State, the smallest Division I school in my state of Illinois, has an athletics department. The whole department brings in $5 million a year.
Oh, wow.
What did Jimbo Fisher just sign an $8 million a year deal to be Texas A&M's head coach? So we're talking about a humongous difference. And that's why you cannot just legislate across the board in Division I, because there's so many different types of schools.
Sure. In that situation, Coach Fisher, one man is getting paid more than the entire revenue that an entire Division I athletics program brings in.
Absolutely. Yep. And I think that's fair because it's all about self-generating revenue. I mean, you're talking about a group of schools that is just incredibly diverse, and not every school is set up the same. And I think that's fine. I think some schools that are humongous statewide businesses, basically, like University of Texas is just this amazing brand. I mean, that's a cultural institution in that state. And it brings in a lot of money. So I think it should be able to afford, things like a nice stadium or a coaching salary that's going to help it continue to generate that money. And you know what? Not every school has that kind of cultural pull, so I think it's fair that they have a less proportional amount of resources.
Sure, that makes sense. What about schools like a Division III program, a Division II program, or even in the NAIA? Now, obviously, the media market is not quite there. A lot of local channels and stuff will cover it, but there's no national network, there's no Longhorn network or Big Ten network.
Exactly.
Where do they get their revenue from?
So that is kind of going back to the old model before college sports was a brand and bringing in money. It's basically just up to the schools. So the students are literally paying their way. They don't get athletic, money. They don't get anything more than academic aid as if you or I were applying to be there. So those are totally self-funded. The NCAA actually does distribute, I think, something around $50 million to the Division III institutions of the country through the NCAA tournament pool, which we can get into later. But by and large, there's no TV, there's very little merchandising, there's very little ticket sales, so it's up to those schools to pay their own way.
Wow, okay, makes sense. Let me ask you about, so you talked about merchandising, and one of the big things that we see is sponsorships. Our alma mater of Baylor just rolled out a new one with Nike. And you even see this across the board at Division III schools, NJCAA or junior colleges will have contracts or sponsors with Nike or Under Armour or Reebok. How do those work? Does that generate extra cash? How big of a portion does that bring in?
It's just like any other sponsorship deal. So they'll provide shirts, shoes, helmets, pads, anything like that. And in exchange, they are the exclusive provider. So it's huge because they're on, TV eyeballs. They get millions of viewers that way. It's great brand exposure for Adidas or Nike or Under Armour.
Assuming the shoe doesn't fall apart in March Madness, right?
Oh, no, too soon, Sam. Too soon for the shoe jokes. In that case, that would be what we call negative publicity. But yeah, it's very simple. It's just, hey, if you agree to be the only, if you agree to only wear our gear, we'll pay you X amount of money. And it is in the order of millions of dollars, but that's what it's worth. These companies don't have to be giving millions of dollars or Adidas doesn't have to give millions of dollars to UCLA, but they know it benefits their bottom line, so they do it because it's great brand exposure.
Yeah. Last question before we go to the break. Where does the NCAA come into this? You mentioned earlier with D3 schools, the NCAA will have a payout if they make the tournament and things like that. But with D1 athletics, where the majority of the money is being driven by the school, by their brand, how much does the NCAA make off of these schools' success?
So we could probably have an entire segment just on how the NCAA operates because it is fascinating, one, and two, probably totally different than everybody at home thinks. You might be thinking that the NCAA is just this ATM that's bringing in tons and tons and tons and tons of money. But actually, it's quite the opposite. There's only really two revenue streams for the NCAA, and it's the NCAA basketball tournament and then all of the associated championship events. Not football, not if you buy a ticket to the Notre Dame game this is really the NCAA basketball tournament generates $800+ million of the $1 billion revenue budget that they bring in every single year. So you're talking about 80% of revenue from one event a year. And I think that that's a lot different than people would expect because you might think that there's all these various things or that they're getting a cut of the TV money. No, it's really just off of the NCAA basketball tournament, which is pretty interesting.
Wow. Don't go away. When we come back, we'll begin there and we'll continue to break down this topic. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Gordon, when we left off, we were talking about the role the NCAA plays. You announced something that is probably breaking news to most viewers, that the NCAA actually generates about 80% of their annual operating budget off of just the NCAA basketball tournament in March.
Isn't that wild? Nobody knows that.
It's crazy. And really, so where the schools contribute to that is that they make the tournament, and that's where, obviously if your team's in the tournament or if there's your alma mater or your brand or whatever's in the tournament, that helps build the NCAA's ability to generate revenue off it. But 80% of the revenue is generated off of that. But the NCAA does play a big role in regulating the way schools can deal with their finances for athletics, right? There's a lot of restriction and regulation on that. Talk us through that a little bit. Why are those regulations there, and what do they do?
First of all, there's an amazing book by Dave Revson, who's incredibly well-known here in the Midwest, especially former ESPN anchor, and now he's with BTN. He wrote a book basically debunking the myth that all of these, the bird's nest of college scandals is new. He goes back to the 1880s, 1890s, and talks about how Yale alumni were paying players. And so this is, first of all, I want to debunk that myth. And you could read Dave's book, Dave Revson, amazing author and anchor. This is not a new problem. People, since literally the dawn of the sport, going back to the late 1860s in New Jersey when Rutgers played, I don't even remember what school, in the first college, I think it was Princeton, in the first college football game. This has been going on since the very beginning of the sport. And basically the NCAA exists to police its bylaws. These are not laws. Like, I mean, if you buy a recruit a pizza, you don't go to jail. It's not a misdemeanor. Right. But as far as just the bylaws of the NCAA. And so the why for that question is to keep everybody on a level playing field, because there is so much at stake, inevitably, when you're dealing with 355 institutions led by humans.
Right.
Those humans will inevitably try to one-up each other through illegal means, or I shouldn't say illegal, but means that are against the code of conduct. So things like impermissible benefits to sway a recruit to come there. That's really the focus of it right now. I mean, those are definitely the most public cases. But also things like, Title IX compliance and, differences between the amount spent on each gender at each school and reporting violations like we saw at Baylor, like sexual abuse allegations. So the NCAA deals with other things other than recruiting, but recruiting is definitely the most public and frequent of the ways that it has to police these schools.
Sure. Let me ask you about those violations, and we'll get into this, in a later episode when we talk about student athletes and paying them and so forth. To your point, some of the biggest violations that we see, or at least the ones that make the news, are about recruiting, and a lot of these come to light after the fact too. And just think in the last decade or so, the big ones that broke, Reggie Bush actually lost his Heisman over that. Cam Newton, Perry Jones III at Baylor. A lot of people don't remember Perry, but the first round draft pick, the Oklahoma City Thunder, had a violation that was actually not even a gift that he was given. It was a loan that his mother had been given. And of course, the infamous Dave Bliss scandal at Baylor, that some of our more viewers that really pay attention to college sports remember, considered one of the worst scandals in the history of college athletics. Talk me through those violations. What is it that what are the rules the NCAA is setting forth, and what is it they're trying to do? Where did these benefits or loans become impermissible?
So really, you're not allowed to accept any benefits, and it goes so far as that people who are your handlers, so to speak, can't even be given benefits to steer you. We just saw a very public case with the Kansas basketball team. A four-star recruit by the name of Silvio De Souza was suspended not only for his first year at Kansas, which was this past year, but also for next season too.
Wow.
Which was an incredibly public case because you're talking about a team that appeared to be right on the verge of a national championship. It was certainly the favorite going into last season. Then they weren't able to have one of their top big men on that team because of these benefits. So anything from money to your handler to steer you to commit to a certain school, money to the actual player or its family or his family, like we saw with the Reggie Bush case that you brought up, where his Heisman Trophy was taken back. Or even things like loans, cars that are given on loan. Really, the NCAA wants to crack down on any possible way that a booster or a school could try to sweeten the deal. So again, we're talking about things that aren't illegal necessarily, but they are definitely against the NCAA's bylaws.
Sure. Let me ask you about, you brought boosters. Let me ask about boosters. If you go to a Division I athletic competition, whether it's basketball, football, soccer, baseball, whatever it is, you inevitably hear somewhere during the announcements, we remind you that you can't approach recruits, you can't, and this is just going as a fan or as a student, and you'll hear this on repeat. What are boosters? And why is that such a big deal for the NCAA and for these universities?
That's a great question, because that definitely came under scrutiny this past year, because there were many cases, especially with the FBI probe in college basketball, that brought that term to the forefront. I mean, you hear it in movies like, what was the movie with Shaq? Blue Chips? Yeah. Sure. Things like that. You hear that word, and I think it's good that you're asking, what does it actually mean? A booster is anybody who is a stakeholder, quote unquote, in being a fan of that institution, whether they're officially linked to the athletic department or just a fan. The school can be punished if one of its fans, one of its boosters operates. So say I own a car dealership in Birmingham, Alabama, and I really, really, really want this running back by the name of Derrick Henry, and I'm using his example just totally by random. He was not implicated in something like this. I just want to make that clear. But say you're a car dealership owner, you say, oh my goodness, if Derrick Henry commits to Alabama, then we're set for the next 2 to 3 years. We need this guy. Let's hook his family up with a Chevy Tahoe, or let's give him a loaner car for the time that he's at Alabama. That was considered illegal according to the NCAA bylaws. So anything from that to cash loans, as we saw with you brought up the Perry Jones situation, it was decreed that he received over $4,000 between loans and a free travel set of expenses for an AAU trip. So really anything from a loan to a cash gift to a car to an apartment, that's oftentimes really just things that people sometimes they need and sometimes things that they just want. But anything that would potentially sway somebody toward choosing that school is against the rules.
Sure. Let me ask you this then. Anyone can be a booster then that's a fan of the school. So,
yes.
and you saw this situation that come up in the movie The Blind Side, and there was an NCAA investigation surrounding the Toohey family with Michael Orr's recruitment to Ole Miss. In the situation where, if I remember correctly, the Tooheys were not ultimately found, or Orr was not suspended, was not found in violation. Where does that line get drawn? And people who cross it, some of it, of course, we know is deliberate. They want to influence a student athlete to go to University of Alabama or University of Texas or wherever. But how much of it is just incidental, where someone talks up a school? I talk about Baylor all the time, and someone says, "Hey, I would love to go there because so and so is a mentor of mine, and so went to Baylor." Or if you remember Michael Orr's response, "I want to go to Ole Miss because my family goes to Ole Miss." Where does that line get drawn for the NCAA? I understand what they're trying to do by keeping money out of it, but where does that line get drawn, and do some people cross that line by accident?
So the line is just, did you receive anything? So Sam Chen can go up to the latest recruit out of Aliquippa, and did I say that right? Aliquippa?
Sure.
Aliquippa? And that's where Mike Dick is from, talking about Western PA powerhouse.
Yes.
I think Darrell Revis is from there too.
Yeah.
Had to check that because I know we've got a lot of people who will know that better than me. But say Sam Chen goes to the spring practice at Aliquippa, and he goes into the weight room and he starts talking up Penn State. And says, "Hey, Penn State would be a great place for you to go. I think you should go to Penn State. That's my home state school. And boy, look at what James Franklin's doing. And there's all these great reasons to go." That's totally fine. You can talk to a recruit all you want, especially if you're just a fan. But once Sam Chen opens up his checkbook and writes a couple numbers down there and gives it to him, or I guess you wouldn't do that nowadays. You do what? Venmo recruit. As far as I know, you could be the first person to commit an NCAA violation using Venmo. But really, the second that you start to give over any kind of asset, whether that's a service or a good, then you would be crossing the line. I know so you ask where specifically is the line. I know, for example, that my family has had college kids over for dinner before that had nothing to do with trying to sway them to go to a school. But they did have to fill out a form and say, we're going to have this dinner and I will be receiving these things, dinner, drinks, whatever. And they had to sign off on it and run that through the NCAA, which I thought was pretty crazy. But that, I guess, would be the limit. That there's some small things you can accept from fans, but once you cross that limit past just dinner, if you're an existing student, or really anything if you're a recruit, then that's where you cross the line.
Sure.
If it goes past dinner.
Sure, that makes sense. Gordon, don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Gordon, thank you for really shining a light on to your point, something I think people follow but don't always know a lot about, and the role that money plays in college athletics. Let me close out by asking you this. Obviously, there are reasons for the rules and the regulations, to your point, and obviously there's times where we look at it and we go, wow, it's a little bit overbearing. Where do you see the future going with financial involvement in college athletics?
Wow, big question. Really hope you tune in for our next segment, because I think we're going to tackle that in depth there. Where do I see it going? For the next 5 to 10 years, I see it staying exactly like this. But long term, eventually, if public opinion reaches a critical mass, then they will have to make some sort of change. And I think we will see student athletes getting some sort of increased compensation package. Next week, I'd like to talk about a different alternative route that I see that has to do with more providing athletes with more options as opposed to coercing one side or the other. So I look forward to talking about that in depth with you. But I definitely think that there's too much pressure built up right now for the tectonic plates to not shift. So we will definitely see changes soon.
Right. How, and quickly in 10 seconds, 15 seconds or less, how soon do you think we'll see those changes?
I think 7, 8, 9 years down the road.
So within the decade,
if not sooner.
Within the decade.
Absolutely, within the decade, for sure.
Great. Well, Gordon,
especially with the speed that things happen these days.
Great. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us. That is all the time that we have for tonight, but tune in again next week. Gordon Voit will be back with us, continuing to break down this very large and complicated, yet very interesting issue. Until then, you can continue this conversation online. Just use the hashtag #FaceTheIssues. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.